Thank you for joining us for podcast number 1, Covering Your Assets During Divorce. Hello, my name is JaneMcAuliffe. I'm a certified divorce financial analyst and president of Collaborative Divorce Strategies. And we're a firm that specializes in financial planning around the divorce process. And we help individuals and couples to figure out an equitable distribution of their marital estate. And we also help you mediate on the financial aspects of your divorce. And ultimately, what we want is for you to understand all the potential financial outcomes of your decisions, get a handle on what your potential future income and expenses may be, and ultimately make good financial decisions now that will add value to your life later on. So I can tell you that I went through my own divorce about 4 years ago now, and I've been in the financial services industry since 1998. So I was very familiar with finances. I was very familiar with investments. And towards the end, before my divorce, I sort of let the reins go and let my spouse handle that. So I can tell you that in my initial state of utter fear and panic about what the future held for me, I was also dealing with major emotions during that process. And I found that I was letting my emotions rule my financial decision-making process. So ultimately, that's what led me into specializing into this niche, because I've been there and I understand that there's a great need for financial planning during this process. So in this process, in this podcast, I want to talk to you about 6 tips on how to begin the divorce process. Usually when clients come to me, no one sets out to get divorced, so they're literally clueless on what the process entails and how to begin and what to expect. So today, I want to go over 6 tips with you to help you get organized and to help you start that process. So I think first and foremost, it's important to explore your options on how you want to go about this. Mediation is an option, and the process for that is usually hiring a third-party neutral who will come and help facilitate conversations between you and your spouse. And I will say that I practice this today in my divorce planning business. And this process works for certain couples and it doesn't for others. And I can tell you that it works for couples who have a relationship currently where they can communicate with one another and are willing to come to the table to figure out some options without using the most amount of emotional and financial resources. I can say that this can go sideways throughout the process if there are some legal issues that are involved, namely child custody, also with determining alimony in the state of Rhode Island. There are no guidelines for alimony, so it really is an arbitrary number. And the court will seek to give you an equitable distribution of your marital estate. It doesn't work like that in all states, but in Rhode Island, we are an equitable distribution state. And what that means is what my definition of fair may not be the same as what my spouse thinks is an equitable distribution of the estate. So mediation can work for some couples if you're really willing to come to a decision together and have buy-in to the outcome. But if there are some legal processes that need to be addressed, then I would urge you to look at another form, which is hiring a lawyer. And I can tell you that I did hire a lawyer for my own case, and it was extremely helpful because I did have some legal issues that needed to be addressed right from the get-go. The other thing is that I was not fully integrated into our daily financial picture at that point. I had let the reins go, and I needed my lawyer to enforce the production of documents so that I could see exactly what had been going on over the previous years. So that's where hiring a lawyer can be very, very helpful, and also helping you set guidelines early on in terms of establishing orders and putting in place some temporary income until you get the process figured out. The next step in the process, which is usually hugely important, is gathering all the documents that are necessary to fill out the financial affidavit. So early on in the process, you will ask to fill out what's called a DR6 in the state of Rhode Island. It's called a financial affidavit in other states. And what this document entails is it's a complete picture of your current income, your current expenses, your current assets, and your current liabilities. And that's signed, and your spouse will have to produce the same type of document. And the court uses this as a guideline, of course, to go back and determine if you are, in fact, getting an equitable distribution of your assets. So, of course, if you haven't been fully involved with the day-to-day finances or paid attention to any of the financial assets that you've collected throughout your marriage, this can present a problem to you. I can tell you that I have a client right now, or a few clients actually, who really have no idea what's at stake. So it's really important for them to get those documents produced early on so that they can have an idea of what their potential outcomes would be. So what should you think about collecting at this point in the game? And that would be any documents related to your bank statements, your investment accounts, your retirement accounts, any production of business documents. Perhaps one of the spouses owns a business. You will need all the business returns, the tax returns for both the business and personal. And that should be produced for at least 3 years, I would say. Secondly, you'd want to get a copy of your estate plan if you've done one, any wills, any trusts. Of course, if there are any prenuptial agreements involved, you'd want to get copies of that. Most importantly, I think people overlook assets that are offered through workplace retirement plans. There are certain accounts that are divisible, and there are certain accounts that are not divisible, and all of them carry different tax consequences. So it's important to collect those documents early on so that you and, say, someone like myself, a certified divorce financial analyst, can determine what those potential outcomes and also the divisibility of them and what that means to you. Okay, so next, I always recommend that people assemble what's called a quote-unquote divorce team. And what does that mean? It means hiring a lawyer if you feel that that's necessary to advocate on your behalf for your best interests and what's legally yours at the end of the day. Secondly, perhaps you want to look at hiring a new tax accountant or CPA. Let's frame it this way. I have a client right now who has been working with her husband with their family CPA. The CPA has prepared their business returns and their personal returns for the past 5 years. And suddenly she goes to the CPA to ask for these documents, and the CPA returns to her and says, hey, I've been working for your spouse and I've been hired by him, so I'm not legally entitled to give you any of that information, and I can't take sides throughout this matter. Well, how does my spouse protect herself? And that becomes the question for a lot of people. How do you get that advice? My role in that process is to help you assemble your divorce team. Hire the CPA that's going to look backwards at whatever the history is on your tax returns, what your historical income and investments may be. The way that I complement them is I look forward and I do the forward planning with you. I help with the budgeting and I help with the planning and what's going to happen when that support ends and what assets should you be negotiating for and which shouldn't you be negotiating for. So that's how we complement one another. Perhaps you want to hire a therapist or a guardian ad litem if you feel like there's a lot of emotional or custody issues that are involved. So that's what I mean by assembling your team. It's important to get a team of people who will advocate for you on your best interests. Fourth, I want you to get a handle on the marital and separate assets. And what does that mean? So everybody gets married at different points in their lives, okay? So what if you've accumulated a number of assets prior to getting married? Well, technically, those could be considered separate assets. Those are assets that are not considered divisible when you're negotiating your settlement. So a lot of the times the question becomes, what was the value of those separate assets at the time that we got married? And I can help you figure out those figures based on that. But then there becomes a lot of intricate questions. Perhaps someone put a down payment on a house and then you've moved in and you've been put on the deed but never on the mortgage. What does that mean for your ownership and the divisibility of that equity in the home? These are all the questions that we help you answer ahead of time. Fifth, it's really important to think early on in the process of what you want to negotiate on. What do you want out of this process? Is it important for you to keep the marital home? Perhaps you want to keep the retirement assets and give your spouse all the equity in the house. And that could potentially create some issues because you and I, meaning, we look at the liquidity of the assets that you're negotiating for. Are we trading illiquid assets for liquid assets or vice versa? And how do you support yourself between now and retirement? How are those negotiations going to help you either purchase a new home or downsize or support your lifestyle? When can you access that? And also, what are the tax consequences? So thinking about what you want out of this early on helps you back into better financial decisions as we move through the planning process. Lastly, I want you to think about what the current income and future support could be. We just talked about the division of your assets, but there's another component to this. There is future income in the form of either child support or alimony. And again, we talked earlier about child support. That's obviously for a finite period of time until your child is 18 or graduates from high school or whatever you've negotiated there. Alimony or spousal support, there are no guidelines in Rhode Island, and it's very difficult to get support for a long period of time. So what do I mean by that? If you're creating your financial picture today and making decisions on keeping the house and trading assets or negotiating for certain assets, when your support ends, what type of a gap will you have in your budget? What type of income will you be making, say 3 to 5 years out? When your support ends, are you still going to be able to afford the things that you've negotiated for today? And that's what we help you figure out as well. So let's get some final takeaways. I would say do start to pay attention as soon as possible in the process and wake up and do not avoid making financial decisions any longer. It's time to start getting involved. Secondly, do hire an attorney if you're having trouble accessing financial information or you feel like there's going to be some other legal issues that could arise throughout the process. Do start to work with professionals that can advise you on the specific intricacies of your divorce and what is important to you. Every divorce is like a fingerprint. It's different every case. So it's important to figure out what specifically pertains to your situation. Don't listen to your neighbor who just got divorced a year ago, because I guarantee you their situation is vastly different than what yours is. Lastly, don't believe that your spouse will take care of you throughout the process. 9 times out of 10, they may say, yes, I just want you to be happy. But when we really break down whatever proposals they've put on the table, it is not an equitable and fair settlement for you. So don't believe that they will just take care of you. Do your homework and get involved. Another important point of that is don't believe that you will get a lot more than your fair share. Unfortunately, that's just not the way that this works. The court will seek an equitable distribution. It's important for you to figure out what the best distribution is for your situation. With that, I'd like to wrap up and say thank you for joining us today for our very first podcast. Please join us for our second podcast of covering your assets in divorce. We're going to be covering home ownership and financial independence in divorce with Beverly Fairbanks. Thanks again for joining me. This is JaneMcAuliffe, CDFA of Collaborative Divorce Strategies. You can find me online at www.collaborativedivorcestrategies.com. On LinkedIn, my name is Jane McAuliffe, or Facebook at Jane McAuliffe or Collaborative Divorce Strategies. Thanks again.